No one was ever supposed to know this. The receipt itself was a ghost, a brittle brown slip of paper tucked inside the binding of a tax ledger from 1849. It was hidden for over 170 years, a secret kept by dust and institutional silence until now. On the morning of April 11th, in the humid mosquito-thick air of Augustine Parish, Louisiana, a transaction took place that was designed to be forgotten. A young man, barely 19, was sold on the courthouse steps. His crime was never officially recorded. The price was $17. A widow Maeve O'Connell purchased him. She was a recent immigrant. Her husband lost to the fever a year prior, and she needed a hand to work her small failing plot of land. She saw a boy, nothing more, a bargain born of some misfortune she couldn't fathom. She paid the 17 copper pennies, signed the deed with a shaky X, and led him away. She never knew his name wasn't Callan. Not really. She never knew the crime he was accused of was a lie, a carefully constructed piece of theater. And she never ever knew who he had been secretly married to just 3 months before. How does a story like this vanish from history? What were we never meant to know? The truth wasn't just buried in an archive. It was erased from the world by a man who had the power to make reality itself bend to his will. He didn't just want the boy broken. He wanted him to cease to exist, to become a footnote on a receipt for 17 cents. A human life valued at less than a handful of nails. The silence that followed wasn't accidental. It was engineered. The man who orchestrated this chilling piece of human theater was Judge Alistair Finch. In Augustine Parish, his word wasn't just law, it was scripture. He was a man carved from granite and swamp shadow, his family having controlled the parish's legal and financial arteries for 3 generations. His power was absolute not because of the land he owned, though he owned thousands of acres, but because he controlled the very definition of truth. He presided over the court. He appointed the sheriff. He held the mortgages on half the businesses in town. To cross Judge Finch was not to risk your livelihood, it was to risk your existence. He could have a man's name stricken from the voting rolls. His credit evaporated, his property seized on a forgotten technicality. He was a king in all but name, and his kingdom was a place of suffocating order, where every person knew their place. The boy Callan had been one of his acquisitions, not born on his plantation, but purchased years earlier from a trader passing through from Virginia. He was quiet, unusually intelligent, and possessed a stillness that unnerved the other slaves and fascinated the judge. Finch saw him not as a person, but as a beautiful, intricate chess piece. He had Callan educated in secret, taught him to read, to understand ledgers, even to speak a little French. It was a whim, a pet project. The judge enjoyed owning something that no one else had, a mind he had personally cultivated, a soul he believed he had authored, but a mind once opened cannot be easily controlled. Callan saw the world with a clarity the judge never anticipated, and that clarity would lead him to the one person in Augustine Parish he was never ever supposed to see as an equal. A whispered historical rumor from that time passed down through the Gullah communities of the coast speaks of shadow marriages, unions between the enslaved and the powerful, consecrated not by law but by older, more binding vows. They were secrets that, if revealed, could unravel the very fabric of that society. This story is one of them. Callan's duties eventually brought him inside the judge's immaculate white, pillared mansion. He was assigned to the library, a vast, silent room filled with books from London and Paris, and it was there he met her, Genevieve Finch, the judge's only daughter. She was 17, a ghost in her own home, educated but isolated, surrounded by wealth but suffocating from the rigid expectations of her father. She was promised to a senator's son from Baton Rouge, a political alliance that would further cement the Finch dynasty. Genevieve, however, had a mind as sharp as her father's and a heart he had long since forgotten how to nurture. She saw in Callan not a servant, not a piece of property, but the only other person in her world who seemed to be truly alive. Their conversations began in whispers, hidden between the leather-bound spines of Voltaire and Shakespeare. He spoke of the stars. She spoke of the sea. He taught her the names of the constellations as he understood them from African folklore. She read him poetry from books her father forbade her to open. They were two prisoners in the same gilded cage. And in that shared confinement, something forbidden and beautiful began to grow. It was a love that was impossible. A love that was a death sentence. And they both knew it. But knowing and stopping were two different things. Their stolen moments became more frequent, more desperate. The silence of the library charged with a meaning that would soon tear their world apart. It was more than a romance. It was a rebellion of the soul. In the dead of winter, under the skeletal branches of a live oak that had stood for 300 years, they made a vow. They knew no priest would marry them, that no law would recognize their union. So they found an old woman on the edge of the swamp, a root doctor named Elizabeth, who practiced traditions that predated the parish, that predated America itself. In a ceremony lit by a single candle with vows spoken in a mixture of English and a language the judge would have called pagan nonsense, they bound themselves to each other. For a few stolen weeks they were husband and wife in a kingdom of two, their secret a fragile shield against the world. But secrets in a place like Augustine Parish have a way of bleeding through. A misplaced book, a lingering look held a second too long, a note discovered by a house servant loyal to the judge. The details of how Finch found out are lost. But the explosion of his rage was legendary. It was not the hot, screaming rage of a common man. It was a cold fury, a terrifying silent pressure that seemed to suck the very air out of a room. He didn't confront them. He didn't rage or accuse. He simply began to move his pieces. The first move was to isolate Genevieve. She was confined to her rooms, her books taken away, the windows of her world shrinking until all she could see was her father's cold, unforgiving face. He never raised his voice. He simply explained in calm, measured tones that she had dishonored her name, her family, and her God. He told her she was sick, that her mind had been poisoned, and that he would cure her. It was a campaign of psychological warfare, designed to break her spirit completely. His second move was against Callan. The judge understood that simply killing the boy would be too merciful. It would also create a martyr. No, death was an ending. The judge wanted an eraser. He needed to utterly annihilate the man his daughter had chosen, to reduce him to a state so low, so pitiful that the very memory of him would become a source of shame for Genevieve. He devised a plan of exquisite cruelty. He took a silver locket, a gift he had given his daughter years ago, and planted it in Callan's small sleeping quarters. Then he had the sheriff, a man whose career and life belonged to Finch, discover the stolen item. Theft was a common enough crime, but theft from the judge's own family was an unforgivable sin. Callan was dragged from his bed in the middle of the night. He never saw Genevieve again. He was taken to the parish jail, a damp stone box where he was held for 2 weeks without a word. He wasn't whipped. He wasn't beaten. The judge's cruelty was more refined. He was simply left alone in the dark with the silence and the rats to contemplate the totality of his powerlessness. The charge was formally read: theft of property valued at 20 point. The punishment by parish law was to be sold at public auction. It was all perfectly legal. It was all a monstrous lie. The judge himself signed the order, his penmanship as elegant and merciless as the man himself. He was not just destroying a man. He was editing a story, rewriting a truth he found offensive, and ensuring that the final draft contained no mention of his daughter's love. The auction was set for April 11th. The morning was thick with a hazy, oppressive heat that promised a storm later in the day. A small crowd gathered on the courthouse lawn, mostly farmers and small-time merchants, men with weathered faces and calculating eyes. They were there for livestock, for a seized cotton gin, for the mundane business of a struggling parish. Callan was the last lot of the day. He was brought out onto the steps, his hands bound in front of him. He was clean, a detail the judge had insisted upon. He was not to look like a common field hand. He was to look like what he was, a house slave, something refined, something that had fallen from a great height. The auctioneer, a man named Bartholomew, who owed Judge Finch a significant debt, began the proceedings. He didn't describe Callan's skills, his literacy, his intelligence. He simply stated the charge and the judgment. Then he announced the opening bid. The court sets the price. He bellowed, his voice straining. At 17 cents. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. 17 cents. It was an insult. It was a joke. An enslaved man in his prime, even when accused of theft, was worth hundreds, perhaps $1,000. A price this low meant one of two things. Either the man was secretly diseased and dying, or this was something else entirely. It was a signal. The smarter men in the crowd understood immediately. This wasn't a sale. It was a ritual, a public shaming orchestrated by an unseen hand. To bid would be to interfere, to involve oneself in the affairs of the powerful, and in Augustine Parish, no one was foolish enough to do that. The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable. It was in that moment of suffocating silence that Maeve O'Connell, the widow, made her move. She didn't understand the politics. She didn't recognize the invisible lines of power shimmering in the air. All she saw was a boy who looked lost in a price she could actually afford. Her husband had left her with 3 acres of unplowed land and a debt at the general store. For 17 cents, she could have a helper. It was simple, desperate arithmetic. She pushed her way through the small crowd. Her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders despite the heat. "I'll take him," she said, her voice thin but clear. 17 cents. The auctioneer Bartholomew looked stunned. He glanced nervously towards the courthouse where he knew Judge Finch was watching from his office window. This was not part of the plan. The plan was for Callan to stand there unsold until the auction ended. A piece of human refuse no one would touch. He would then be remanded to the parish work farm, a place from which no one ever returned healthy. But a bid had been made, a legal public bid. To refuse it would be to break the very laws the judge claimed to uphold. Bartholomew hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. 17 cents from the widow, he called out, his voice cracking. He looked around, praying someone would counter, would do something to stop this unforeseen complication. But the crowd remained silent, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. They knew what this woman did not. She wasn't just buying a slave, she was picking up a cursed object, a piece of a story she was never meant to be a part of. Going once, Bartholomew stammered, his eyes darting back to the courthouse window. Going twice, he paused, giving the universe one last chance to correct this error. Nothing. The cicadas screamed in the trees, a sound like frayed nerves. Sold, he finally choked out, slamming his gavel down with a sound that felt both final and deeply wrong. To the widow O'Connell for 17 cents. Maeve counted out the coins, her hand trembling slightly as she dropped them into Bartholomew's sweaty palm. The deed of sale was drafted by a clerk whose hands moved with unnatural speed, as if he wanted the document out of his possession as quickly as possible. Maeve signed with her ex. The transaction was complete. She had just purchased a human being for the price of a spool of thread as she led Callan away from the courthouse steps. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on that second-story window, the one where he knew the judge was watching, their gazes locked for a brief, searing moment across the square. In that look, 1,000 unspoken things were communicated. It was a look of triumph from the judge, a look that said, "See what I have made you." And from Callan, it was a look of something else. Not defeat, not hatred. It was a look of terrifying, unshakable promise. Maeve saw none of it. She was just a poor widow who had made a desperate bargain. She had no idea she was now the keeper of a king's ruined treasure, the accidental guardian of a secret that could still burn Augustine Parish to the ground. She was taking him home to her small, dusty cabin, never knowing she had just bought a man who was married to the most powerful man's daughter. The cruelest lies are often told in silence. This quote, attributed to the philosopher Robert Louis Stevenson, perfectly captures the atmosphere of the O'Connell cabin in the days that followed. Maeve didn't know what to do with Callan. He was not defiant, but he was absent. He worked from sunup to sundown, clearing the stubborn clay, packed soil, his movements efficient and tireless. He did everything she asked of him, his obedience so absolute it was unsettling. But he never spoke unless spoken to, and his eyes held a haunted, distant quality. as if he were looking at a world only he could see. Maeve tried to talk to him. She asked about his life before, a question he answered with a simple, "I was in service, ma'am." She asked if he had a family. He just shook his head. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the humid air outside. It was a silence filled with his unspoken history and her unasked questions. She was a simple woman, devout and kind-hearted. The institution of slavery had always been an abstraction to her, a thing that happened on the grand plantations, far from her small life. Now it was sitting at her rough-hewn table, a living, breathing enigma. She found herself watching him, trying to piece together the puzzle. His hands, though calloused now from the farm work, were not the hands of a field laborer. They were long and slender. The way he carried himself, even in his worn-out clothes, had a grace that seemed out of place. One evening, she saw him staring up at the night sky, his lips moving silently. He wasn't praying. He was naming the stars. The judge, meanwhile, was consumed by a quiet, festering rage. The widow's interference had spoiled the perfect symmetry of his revenge. Callan was supposed to disappear into the anonymity of the parish work farm, a place of slow, grinding oblivion. Instead, he was living just 2 miles away, a constant living reminder of his daughter's betrayal. Every day that Callan existed was an affront to the judge's power. He became obsessed. He had the sheriff ride past the O'Connell place twice a day, a silent act of intimidation. He put pressure on the general store owner to deny Maeve credit, hoping to starve her out, to force her to sell the boy. But Maeve was resilient, and the small community of poor farmers, who held no love for the judge, began to help her in small ways. A sack of flour left on her porch, a few jars of preserves. They saw it as a quiet act of defiance against the man who held them all in his grip. The judge's frustration grew. He needed Callan gone, but it had to be done in a way that didn't lead back to him. Another public spectacle was out of the question. It had to be quiet. Final. He began to look for an instrument, a man who could operate in the shadows, someone who could erase a problem without leaving a trace. He found such a man in a Cajun tracker named Roch, a shadowy figure who lived deep in the swamps and was rumored to have skills that were not entirely natural. Roch was a man who found people who didn't want to be found and who, for the right price, could make people disappear forever. The dynamic on the farm began to shift in subtle ways. Callan, realizing the judge's gaze was still upon him, started to let slivers of his true self show. It was a calculated risk. He needed an ally, and this simple widow was the only one he had. One evening, he noticed her struggling with her late husband's account book. She could read numbers, but not words. Quietly, he stepped forward. "If I may, ma'am," he said, his voice soft. He took the ledger and in a few minutes had organized the chaotic entries, his handwriting a fluid, elegant script. Maeve stared at the page, then at him, her eyes wide with astonishment. "Where did you learn to do that?" she whispered. The judge valued certain skills, he answered, the first hint of irony she had ever heard from him. He began to help her in other ways, showing her how to better irrigate the fields, how to mend tools she thought were broken. He was not just a laborer, he was an architect of survival. A bond, fragile and unspoken, started to form between them. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It was the wary respect of two people clinging to the same piece of driftwood in a vast, hostile ocean. Maeve began to see him not as 17 cents worth of muscle, but as a man of profound and mysterious depth, and with that realization came a terrifying thought. Whatever he had done to incur the wrath of Judge Finch, it must have been something extraordinary. She was harboring not just a runaway, but a secret, and she started to understand that secrets in Augustine Parish had a very high price. A chilling visual description from an old parish diary saw the judge's man, Roch, in town today. He does not walk like other men. He glides silent as a water moccasin. In his eyes, they are the color of swamp mud and they see everything you try to hide. This was the man who now began to circle Maeve's small farm. Callan felt his presence before he ever saw him. It was a change in the air, a stillness in the woods that felt unnatural. The birds would go quiet. The insects would cease their chirping. It was the predatory silence of a hunter closing in on his prey. Callan knew what it meant. The judge had grown impatient. Time was running out. He had to act. He had one hidden card left to play, a secret he had guarded even from Genevieve. Before he was taken, he had managed to hide the only proof of his marriage, not a document which could be burned, but something far more permanent. He had taken a small book of poetry Genevieve had given him, and on the inside back cover, using an ink he had made from berries and rust, he had written a short account of their vows, their secret ceremony, and he had signed it. Beside his name, he had pricked Genevieve's finger with a needle and pressed her bloody thumbprint to the page. It was a symbol, a piece of irrefutable truth. If that book were ever found, it would be a permanent stain on the Finch legacy, a story that could not be easily erased. The book was hidden in the one place the judge would never think to look, inside the old parish church, tucked behind a loose stone in the back of the fireplace. Callan knew he couldn't retrieve the book himself. He was being watched. Every move he made was scrutinized. He needed to get a message to someone, but he trusted no one. The entire parish was a web of the judge's spies. So, he devised a desperate plan, one that hinged on the courage of a woman who still knew nothing. He began to draw in the dirt, scratching out patterns with a stick while he worked in the fields. At first, Maeve thought it was just idle doodling, but then she noticed the patterns were intricate, almost like maps. One evening, as she brought him a cup of water, he didn't look at her. He just kept drawing, his finger tracing a line from a crude drawing of her cabin to a drawing of the church steeple. Then he drew a small square inside the church, and beside it, a shape that looked like a flame. He looked up at her, his eyes conveying a desperate, silent plea. It was a message without words, a map drawn in dust. He was trusting her to understand. Maeve felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. She knew what he was asking. He wanted her to go to the church, to the fireplace. He wanted her to retrieve something for him. To do so would be to move from being a passive observer in this drama to an active conspirator. It was a choice. She could erase the map with her foot, pretend she hadn't understood, and live out her days in quiet servitude. Or she could trust this strange, silent man she had bought for 17 cents and step into the heart of the storm. For 2 days, Maeve was paralyzed by indecision. The fear of Judge Finch was a physical thing, a sickness in her gut. But the look in Callan's eyes haunted her. It wasn't the look of a criminal. It was the look of a man trying to save his own soul. On the third night, she made her choice. After Callan was asleep in the small barn that served as his quarters, she slipped out of her cabin, a small lantern clutched in her hand. The walk to the church was the longest 2 miles of her life. Every rustle in the trees sounded like the swamp tracker watch. Every shadow seemed to hold the judge's cruel, calculating gaze. The church was dark and silent. The back door was never locked. She crept inside, the air cool and smelling of old wood and candle wax. She found the fireplace, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her fingers, rough and calloused from farm work, searched the stones in the dim lantern light. She found it, a single stone that was slightly loose. With a broken piece of kindling, she pried it open. Inside the dark cavity, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a small leather-bound book. She pulled it out, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She didn't open it. She didn't want to know. She just knew it was the source of all this danger. The secret that was worth more than a man's life. She tucked it into her apron, replaced the stone, and fled back into the night, the book feeling like a block of ice against her skin. She had crossed the line. There was no going back now. When she returned to the farm just before dawn, she found Callan waiting for her outside the cabin. He wasn't in the barn. He was standing there watching the road as if he had been standing guard. He saw the book in her hands, and for the first time since she had met him, a flicker of something other than despair crossed his face. It was relief so profound it was almost painful to watch. He took the book from her, his fingers brushing hers. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to thank me," she said, her own voice trembling. You just have to tell me what we do now." Before he could answer, a sound cut through the pre-dawn stillness. A dog barking frantically from a neighboring farm. Then another. Callan's head snapped up, his body instantly rigid. "He's here," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Roch." He pushed the book back into her hands. "There is a man," he said, speaking quickly, his words precise. "His name is Silas. He works the ferry at the Black Creek crossing. He is an old friend, one of the few the judge does not own. Give him this book. Tell him the mockingbird is free." Maeve stared at him, confused. "What about you?" "The judge doesn't just want the book," Callan said, his eyes already looking past her towards the dark tree line. "He wants me. I will lead Roch away from here. I will give you time. Go now." He turned and ran, not towards the road, but directly into the thick, tangled woods behind the cabin. A deliberate, sacrificial act. Maeve stood frozen for a second, clutching the book, his strange message echoing in her ears. Then she heard the sound of someone moving through the undergrowth, moving with an unnerving speed and silence. She turned and ran. Maeve ran like she had never run in her life, her breath tearing at her lungs, the dark woods pressing in on all sides. She didn't know the paths. She stumbled over roots, her face whipped by low-hanging branches. She just knew the direction of Black Creek, and she ran towards it, fueled by a terror she had never known. Behind her, she could hear the chase. Not the sounds of a clumsy pursuit, but the chillingly efficient sounds of a predator. A snapped twig here, a soft footfall there, and Callan further ahead, making just enough noise to keep the hunter focused on him, drawing the danger away from her. It was a race against the sunrise. She finally burst out of the woods onto the muddy banks of Black Creek. The ferry was just a simple wooden raft operated by a pulley system. A stooped, gray-haired black man stood beside it, preparing for the day's first crossing. "Silas!" she gasped, stumbling towards him. The man looked up, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He took in her torn dress, her panicked expression, the book clutched in her hand. "Are you Silas?" she repeated, her voice frantic. "I am," he said, his voice a low, calming rumble. "Kaylin sent me," she panted, holding out the book. "He said to give you this. He said, the mockingbird is free." Silas's weathered face showed no surprise. He took the book with a steady hand, his expression grim. He understood the code. It meant Callan was activating the final, most desperate part of their plan. It meant he likely wasn't going to survive the night. He had chosen to sacrifice himself to ensure the truth survived. From across the creek, a sound echoed through the morning mist. A single sharp cry, a sound of pain abruptly cut short. Maeve flinched, her blood running cold. She knew it was Callan. Silas's jaw tightened. "Get on the ferry, ma'am," he said, his voice urgent. He didn't wait for her. He untied the rope and began pulling them across the churning brown water, his old muscles straining with the effort. As they reached the middle of the creek, they saw him. Roch the tracker emerged from the tree line on the opposite bank. He was holding a long, wicked-looking knife, its blade stained dark. He stood there watching the ferry, his face a mask of cold frustration. He was too late. Maeve stared at the man who had just hunted and likely killed the boy she had bought for 17 cents. She felt a wave of nausea and grief so intense it buckled her knees. She had been a pawn in a game she couldn't comprehend, and people were dying because of it. "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. Silas didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the far bank as if daring the tracker to try and cross. "Now," he said, his voice resonating with a deep, weary sorrow, "the judge loses." He pulled the book from his coat, holding it up for Roch to see across the water. A gesture of defiance, a promise that this story would not end in the silence of the swamp. Roch simply turned and melted back into the woods. His mission both a success and a catastrophic failure. They reached the other side of the creek, a land that felt like a different country, a place where the judge's immediate power could not reach. Silas secured the ferry and led Maeve to a small hidden cabin a short walk from the bank. Inside, an oil lamp cast a warm glow on a simple room. Silas placed the book on the table with a reverence that surprised her. "You are safe here for now," he said. "Who are you?" Maeve finally asked. "Really? I knew Callan's mother." Silas began, his voice dropping low, taking on the quality of a confession. "Years ago, before the judge bought her, we were from the same place in Virginia. I promised her I would look out for her boy." He paused, his gaze distant. "I failed. I stood by and did nothing for years, too afraid of what the judge could do. Callan knew I ran this ferry. He knew I had connections to people who help others disappear, the Underground Railroad. He contacted me weeks ago before any of this happened. He had a feeling the judge knew his secret. We made a plan, a desperate one. Getting him out was one thing, but he refused to leave without the proof. Without this book." He tapped the cover. He said, "A man's life is temporary, but the truth can be permanent if someone is brave enough to protect it." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "He didn't think he would survive. He made me promise that if he sent the signal, I would get the book north, no matter the cost. He sacrificed himself so that one day everyone will know what Judge Finch did to his own daughter." Maeve finally broke. The tears she had held back for days, for weeks, finally came. A storm of grief for a boy she barely knew, but whose courage had shattered her world. She wept for his lost love, for his stolen life, for the sheer monstrous injustice of it all. Silas let her cry, his silence a respectful witness to her sorrow. When she was finished, her body aching with the force of her sobs, she looked at the book on the table. "His wife," she said, her voice trembling. "The judge's daughter. What happened to her?" Silas's face hardened. "After the judge locked her away, he brought in a doctor from New Orleans, a man who specializes in female hysteria. They declared her mentally unfit, a danger to herself. She was sent to an asylum in Mobile, a place people go to be forgotten. She's a prisoner, same as Callan was. The judge didn't just take her husband. He took her mind, her freedom, her very name. As far as the world knows, Genevieve Finch had a nervous breakdown and was sent away for her health. The story is neat, clean, and utterly false. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a murder of the soul, a perfectly legal and socially acceptable form of annihilation. The judge hadn't just erased Callan. He had erased his own daughter, turning her into a ghost long before she was dead. Now Maeve understood the 17 cents, the auction, the tracker. It was all part of a meticulous evil masterpiece of control, and she, the ignorant widow, had stumbled onto the stage and ruined the final act. "What's in the book?" Maeve asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas opened it carefully. He turned to the inside back cover. There in Callan's elegant script was the story of their secret marriage. Below the text were 2 signatures. One was Callan's. The other was not a signature, but a small brown-red smudge, a bloody thumbprint, Genevieve's mark. Silas said softly, "He told me about it. Proof that she entered the vow of her own free will. In the right hands, this book destroys the judge's entire narrative. It proves he manufactured the theft charge. It proves he institutionalized his own daughter to cover up a truth he couldn't stomach." He closed the book. "My contacts will get this to abolitionist publishers in Philadelphia. It will be printed. The story will be told. It won't bring Callan back. It might not even free Genevieve, but it will be a crack in the judge's throne. It will be a fire that he can never completely extinguish." He looked at Maeve, his expression serious. "But you can't go back to Augustine Parish ever. The judge will never stop looking for you. You're the loose end, the witness who knows the whole story." Maeve thought of her small farm, the only home she had. She thought of her husband's grave. It was all gone, wiped away by a history she never asked to be a part of. She was adrift, a refugee from a secret war. "Where will I go?" she asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke. "North," Silas said. "We'll get you to a safe place. A new life. It's the least we can do, it's what he would have wanted." And so Maeve O'Connell disappeared. Aided by Silas and the quiet, determined network of the Underground Railroad, she traveled by night, hiding in barns and secret cellars, moving steadily north until the Spanish moss of Louisiana was just a bad memory. She changed her name, cut her hair, and became someone else, a woman with no past. The book traveled with her, a sacred, Dangerous relic passed from one steady hand to another until it finally reached Philadelphia. In the spring of 1850, an anonymous pamphlet began to circulate. It was titled A Parish of Lies, and it told the story of a powerful Southern judge, his daughter, and the educated slave he destroyed to protect his family's name. It didn't name Judge Finch or Augustine Parish directly. To do so would have been too dangerous for the printers. But the details were specific enough that those in power in Louisiana knew exactly who it was about. The story was dismissed by the mainstream press as abolitionist propaganda, but the damage was done. The whisper had started. The crack in the throne had appeared. The judge's power, which had once seemed absolute, now had a boundary. He became more reclusive, more paranoid, seeing betrayal in every shadow. He spent a fortune trying to find the source of the pamphlet, hunting for the widow who had vanished, but he found nothing. He was fighting a ghost. The truth once released could not be recaptured. What of the others? Judge Alastair Finch died in 1863, not from a bullet in the war that tore his world apart, but from a stroke alone in his grand library, surrounded by the books that had been the backdrop for his daughter's forbidden love. They say in his final years, he would rage at unseen figures, his mind consumed by the enemies, real and imagined, who had tarnished his perfect legacy. Genevieve Finch remained in the asylum in Mobile for the rest of her life. She died in 1888. The official cause of death was pneumonia, but the asylum records note that she spent her last 40 years in a state of quiet, detached silence, never speaking a word to anyone. Whether her silence was a result of the asylum's brutal treatments or her own willed act of eternal mourning, no one knows. She became the ghost her father had always wanted her to be. Roch the Tracker disappeared back into the swamps. His name appears one last time in the historical record in a sheriff's report from 1854. He was found dead floating in a bayou, his body bloated and unrecognizable. The report lists the cause as an alligator attack, but old rumors persist that someone caught up with him, that a debt from that night on Black Creek was finally paid. Silas continued to operate his ferry, a quiet, unassuming man helping countless others find their way to freedom, his own act of atonement lasting a lifetime. And Kalin, his body was never found. Roch likely buried him in an unmarked grave deep in the swamp, another soul absorbed by the dark Louisiana soil. He was erased just as the judge intended, but his story, the one he died to protect, survived. It became a quiet legend, a cautionary tale whispered by those who knew the truth. It was a testament to the fact that you can silence a person, but you cannot kill an idea. You can bury a body, but you can't bury the truth. Not forever. The widow Maeve, who lived to be an old woman in a small town in Ohio, never spoke of what happened. But they say she kept a small, worn-out pamphlet in a locked box until the day she died. The story of the boy she bought for 17 cents. The boy who was secretly a husband, a rebel, a king in a world that refused to see him. If you visit Augustine Parish today, you will find no official record of any of this. The Finch family name is still on the courthouse, on the library. History, as it is written, is the story of the winners. But if you go down to the Black Creek crossing, some of the old folks might tell you a different story. They'll tell you about a ghost who sometimes walks the woods looking for a book. They'll tell you about a love that was stronger than the law, and about a truth that cost everything. If you've come this far with me down this dark and hidden path, comment "The Mockingbird is free" below. You're not just watching a story anymore. You're becoming a keeper of it. A witness to a history that was deliberately erased. It's a heavy burden, isn't it? To know something that was meant to be forgotten. The receipt for 17 sits in a university archive now. A historical curiosity. Most who see it just see a strange, sad transaction from a brutal era. They see the price and they shake their heads at the cruelty. But they don't know the truth. They don't know the story behind the ink. They don't see the ghost of a secret marriage, the cold fury of a powerful judge, or the impossible courage of a woman who chose to trust a stranger. They don't know that those 17 pennies were the price of a king's ransom in love and rebellion. They see a receipt for a slave. But you You see a declaration of war, a war fought in whispers, in hidden books, and in the hearts of those who refuse to be erased. It's a reminder that the most important histories are often the ones that leave the faintest tracks. The ones you have to dig for, the ones you have to fight to keep alive, the ones that powerful men tried to bury under the weight of their laws and their lies. The system that allowed a man like Judge Finch to exist, the one that made his actions perfectly legal, was not just a collection of laws. It was a psychological prison. It was built on the idea that some people were objects, that their lives and loves had no value except what was assigned to them by their owners. Callan and Genevieve's crime wasn't theft, and it wasn't just love. Their crime was believing they were equals. Their rebellion was the act of seeing the full humanity in each other. That was the one sin the judge and the entire world he represented could not tolerate. Because if a slave and a master's daughter could be husband and wife, if they could be bound by a vow that transcended law and property, then the entire foundation of their society was a lie. It would mean that power was just a construct, that social order was a fragile fiction, and that the chains were not just on the wrists of the enslaved, but on the minds of the enslavers as well. The judge had to destroy them, not just to punish them, but to protect his own sanity, to reinforce the walls of the reality he had built around himself. His cruelty wasn't just an act of revenge. It was an act of desperate self-preservation. He was trying to kill a truth that threatened to expose him as a fraud, a king ruling over a kingdom of ghosts. And yet, the story survived. The truth, once set loose, found its way into the cracks of history, whispered by those who refused to forget. It's a reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that the smallest act of courage can echo for generations. The mockingbird is free, and so is the story. If you want more stories that history tried to erase, subscribe to Dark Diaries, hit the bell, and share this video with someone who isn't afraid to face the shadows of the past. Until next time, remember the past is never as distant as we'd like to believe.